The wolf's breath came in ragged pulls, fogging the cold air between them, and Wren pressed both hands flat against his side to feel where the bleeding was worst. Blood, hot and copper bright, soaked through the bandage strip she'd torn from her own petticoat. Pine smoke. Wet fur. Underneath it all, something else. Something that smelled like a storm about to break, like rain on hot stone. And it didn't belong to any wolf she'd ever skinned or sold or buried in these woods. He was enormous. Not large the way a big dog is large. Large the way a felled tree is large. The way a held breath before thunder is large. His shoulder alone came up past her hip where he lay on her cabin floor. And the leg the snare had caught was swollen dark, the steel teeth still biting where she hadn't yet managed to pry them free. "Hold still," she whispered. Not because he understood her, but because the sound of her own voice kept her hands from shaking. "I'm not going to hurt you worse than you already are. I promise that much." His eye, amber, rimmed with a thread of silver she'd never seen on any wolf in these hills, rolled toward her. Not the wild, cornered look of a trapped animal. Something steadier. Something that watched her the way the toll collector watched her father's coin purse, weighing, deciding, waiting to see what she'd do with the power she held over him. She had a great deal of power over him just then. One clean cut to the throat and her family would eat through the spring on what his pelt alone would bring at the Northreach market. She thought of Pip's stomach growling under his blanket 3 feet from the hearth. She thought of her father's bad knee and the toll debt scratched into the ledger at Bitter Sedge Crossing. She thought of all of it, kneeling there with her hands slick with a king's blood, though she didn't know that yet. She pried the trap open instead. The wolf screamed. There was no gentler word for the sound a throat that size could make, and then went so silent and so still that for one heartbeat she thought she'd killed him with mercy instead of the knife. Then his ribs moved again, shallow, and she breathed. "There," she said. "That part's done. The worst part's still to come, I won't lie to you about that." He didn't growl at her. That was the first thing that should have told her something. A wolf in pain, freed by a stranger's hands, ought to have snapped at her wrist on principle alone. Instead, he watched her thread a bone needle with boiled sinew, watched her tear more of her petticoat, watched her with an attention that had nothing animal in it at all. Outside, the wind worked through the bare branches with a sound like something dragging its nails along old wood, and the fire popped once, and somewhere far off a real wolf howled. Small, ordinary. Nothing like the creature bleeding on her floor. "You're not from around here," she told him, because the silence needed filling and he wasn't going to fill it. "I've trapped this line since I was 9 years old. I'd remember a wolf your size." She paused, threading the needle through torn muscle as gently as her hands knew how, which was not very gently at all, not with hands that had spent a lifetime skinning rabbits and resetting steel. "I'd remember a wolf this quiet too. You're not even snapping at me. Most wolves I free snap at me out of spite alone." His ear twitched. Just that. "My mother used to say wolves only go quiet like this for 2 reasons, she went on, and her voice dropped without her meaning it to. Low and even, a sing-song cadence she didn't notice slipping into the same 3 notes her mother used to hum over a cradle. Either they're dying, or they've decided you're worth trusting. She tied off the first stitch. "I'd rather it be the second one, selfishly. I don't fancy explaining a dead wolf on my floor to my father in the morning." The wolf's eye tracked her hands the whole time she worked. Not her face. Her hands. The scar across her left palm, pale and crescent-shaped, left by a trap spring that had snapped wrong when she was 7. The calluses. The steadiness that came from years of doing violence to small animals so her family could eat. Whatever he was reading in them, he seemed satisfied by it. Because somewhere past midnight, with 4 stitches closed and a 5th half done, the great body beside her hearth went slack in something closer to sleep than death, and stayed there. She didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the cold stone of the hearth and her knees drawn up and watched the rise and fall of a chest broad enough to be a door, and somewhere in the small hours she found herself humming again. The same 3 notes, over and over. The lullaby with no name that her mother used to sing before the fever took her 4 winters back. And she told herself it was only to keep herself awake. It was not entirely the truth. The wolf's breathing slowed to match it, like something falling into step beside her, and that frightened her more than his sighs ever had. By the time gray light came through the shutter cracks, he was gone. No blood trail, no broken latch, just an empty space on her floor still warm where he'd lain, and the bandages she'd used neatly folded. Folded, not torn loose, as though something with no hands at all had taken care to leave them tidy, set in a small stack by the door. She told herself a great many things that morning, kneeling there with her palm pressed flat to the warm floorboards. That she'd imagined the folding. That exhaustion did strange things to a person's eyes after a night like that. That whatever she'd just done, whatever debt or danger she'd just stitched into her own life with bone needle and boiled sinew, it was over now, and the wolf, whatever he was, would never cross her path again. She was wrong about that last part most of all. Her father's cane knocked twice against the door frame before he pushed it open, and the smell of him came in ahead of his voice. Wood smoke and tallow, and the bitter green of the willow bark he chewed for his knee. Thomas Ashby had a way of singing under his breath while he worked, always off the note by half a step, an old habit from before Wren's mother died that he'd never managed to lose and never seemed to notice he still had. "Empty trap on the boundary line," he said, by way of good morning, easing himself onto the bench with the particular grimace that meant the cold had gotten into the joint overnight. "Saw the snag of fur on the wire from 40 paces. Big animal by the size of that print. What did you bring home, Rennie?" "Nothing," she said, and hated how easily the lie came. "Snare snapped before I got there. Whatever it was tore itself free." He looked at her a moment too long. Thomas Ashby had not survived 20 years on the Northreach border by being a stupid man, even with a bad knee and a worse temper for the toll collector's ledger. But he was tired, and Pip was already awake and asking after breakfast with the particular whine of a 9-year-old who has been hungry more mornings than not, and so her father let it go. The way he let a great many things go that winter, because there was no food in arguing, and there was no time for anything that didn't put food on the table. "Pity," was all he said. "Tolls due end of month. That pelt would have covered half of it." Wren said nothing. She thought of a stitch closing under her own hands, of an amber eye watching her decide, and she did not regret it. Not yet. Not with the particular sharp clarity regret takes once it's earned its name. She only felt the cold place in her chest where the lie sat, small and growing, the first thread in a debt she had no idea yet how large it would become. 3 days passed in the ordinary rhythm of a poor holding on a hungry border. Trap lines walked at dawn, the tollstones at the edge of the wood like gray teeth marking where her family's right to hunt ended, and the Northreach Pack's land began. Pip lining up bird bones on the windowsill, and naming each one like old friends, her father singing badly while he scraped a fox hide thin enough to sell. Wren told no one about the wolf, not her father, not the toll collector, not even Pip, who could be trusted with secrets the way a sieve could be trusted with water. She thought of him anyway, more than was sensible. She found herself listening for a howl that didn't sound like any of the others, catching herself at the work table with her hands gone still, and her mind 100 paces into the dark wood, wondering whether stitches that size had held, whether a wolf with no pack to nurse him had found somewhere warm to mend. On the fourth morning, riders came up the toll road wearing the black and silver of the Northreach pack, and Wren's first thought, sharp and instinctive, was that someone had found the blood on her floorboards after all. She was not entirely wrong. The man who led them did not dismount. He sat his horse like a man accustomed to looking down at people, which, Wren would learn, he was. Lord Garrick Vane wore gloves even now, in the dim gray cold of a forest morning where no one else troubled with such delicacy, and the scent that reached her on the wind was wrong in a way she couldn't name at first. Too clean, too sharp. A hard green note of clove oil layered over whatever lay beneath it, like a curtain drawn across a window. In a world where scent told the truth a face could hide, a man who masked his own was a man worth watching, though Wren did not know enough yet to know that. Wren Ashby. He did not ask. He confirmed, the way a man confirms a fact already written on a page in front of him. Daughter of Thomas Ashby, trapper, of this holding. That's me. She kept her chin up because her father had taught her that much at least. That the poor who flinched first lost first. Something the matter, my lord? A snare line was found 3 days past, broken, on pack land past the toll stones. Blood enough on the ground to mean a kill, or near enough to one. Pack land, Miss Ashby, not yours to trap. His gloved hand rested on the saddle horn, easy, almost bored, but his eyes did not match the boredom of his hand. You'll come with us. The matter will be heard properly. Behind her, she heard her father's cane strike the porch boards twice, fast, the sound he made when his temper outran his knee. She's done nothing the toll line doesn't allow for, my lord. The boundary's been loose as long as— The boundary, Garrick said, without looking at him, has not been loose. It has been unenforced. There's a difference, and the difference has become rather urgent this week. Something moved behind his eyes when he said it. Not anger, not quite. Wren would only understand much later what that flicker had actually been. A man recalculating in real time how much danger one trapper's daughter might represent to a plan 4 years in the careful making. She went. There was no version of that morning where she didn't go, not with armed riders at her door and her father's knee too bad to stand between them and her, not with Pip's wide eyes following her from the window. She told herself, climbing up behind one of the silent guardsmen, that it was a fine to be paid and a scolding to be endured and nothing more. She told herself a great many things that week. She was getting rather practiced at it. The road to Ravensgate Hall took the better part of a day, and Wren spent most of it doing what she'd always done best, watching and saying very little. The forest changed as they rode. Poorer wood gave way to taller, older trees, the kind that had never known an axe, and the air itself seemed to thicken with 100 different scents she had no names for yet. Leather and oiled steel, hearth smoke from a dozen different fires, the green tang of crushed pine where patrols walked the same path daily, and beneath it all, a current of something that made the hair on her arms rise without her understanding why, a wrongness, faint but constant, like a held note slightly off true. The hall itself rose out of the trees the way a held breath rises into a shout. Stone the color of old bone, towers thick with ivy gone red for autumn, banners snapping black and silver in a wind that smelled, even from the gate, of roasting meat and tallow candles, and too many bodies pressed into rooms built for fewer. Wren had never seen so many people who weren't hungry. They put her in a hall with a ceiling 3 times the height of her whole cabin, and stone underfoot cold enough to bite through her boots, and made her stand while a row of pack lords looked at her the way her father looked at a hide he was deciding whether to buy. Trespass on Northreach land, Garrick said, to the hall rather than to her. his voice carrying easy and practiced. A trap line set past the toll stones, found broken, blood enough at the scene to suggest serious injury to whatever creature was caught there. The girl trapped illegally. What she trapped, and what became of it, she has so far declined to say. A murmur went through the hall. Wren felt it on her skin before she heard the words in it, felt the room's attention sharpen, scent and sound both, the way a held breath sharpens a room. Somewhere behind the Lord's bench, a man shifted his weight, and the air moved with him, and Wren caught, faint under hearth smoke and old stone, a thread of something that stopped every other thought in her head. Cedar smoke, rain on hot stone. She knew that scent. She had spent a whole night with her hands buried in fur that carried it. "I have nothing to say that hasn't already been said," she told the hall, because her mind was racing too fast to manage anything cleverer, and because some old animal instinct told her that whatever was about to happen, the safest thing she could do was say as little as possible until she understood the shape of the danger. "The trap broke. Whatever was in it got free before I reached it." "Convenient," Garrick said, dry as old paper. "True," she said. "Convenient and true aren't strangers to each other, my lord, whatever your experience of the pair." A sound went through the hall lord's bench that might, in a kinder room, have been a laugh. It died fast. That was when the doors at the far end opened, and the room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with manners. He came in walking like a man who had been told, repeatedly and recently, not to walk at all, and had decided to do it anyway out of pure stubbornness. One arm was bound close against his side beneath a black coat that did nothing to hide the careful, controlled way he favored his ribs with every step. He was taller than every man in that hall, broad through the shoulder in a way that made the space around him feel smaller, and his hair was dark and damp at the temples as though he'd only just left a sickbed against every order given to keep him in it. Wren's heart did something complicated and traitorous in her chest the moment the scent reached her fully. Cedar smoke, storm iron, rain on stone. Confirmed now beyond any doubt, because there, at the open collar of his shirt where the fabric had slipped, she could see it. A thin crescent of old scar tissue at his throat, pale against his skin, exactly where her fingers had rested 3 nights ago while she counted his pulse, and prayed it wouldn't stop. He stopped 3 paces into the hall. His gaze found her the way a compass finds north, not searching, not scanning the room first, straight to her, as though some other sense had already told him exactly where to look. "Alaric," someone breathed near the front, half horror, half relief. "You should be—" "I should be a great many things," the Alpha King of Northreach said, in a voice gone rough and low from disuse, and he did not look away from her once. "Apparently dead, for one. 3 nights passed, by most accounts." He took another step, slow, deliberate. Every eye in the hall swinging between him and the ragged trapper's daughter standing accused at its center. "I find myself instead very much alive, and very curious why the girl accused of poaching on my land is the same one whose hands I'd know blind, in the dark, with my throat half open and my leg in steel." The hall did not breathe. "You," he said to her, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite anything Wren had a name for. "You're the one who freed me." Garrick's gloved hand had gone very still on the rail of the Lord's bench. "I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty," Wren said, because some part of her brain that still functioned was screaming that this was dangerous in a way she didn't yet understand. That an Alpha King recognizing a trapper's daughter in front of his entire court was not safety. It was a door opening onto a room she had no map of at all. "I told the truth. The trap broke. Whatever was in it ran." "It didn't run," Alaric said. "It walked. slowly, half dead, into a cabin with smoke coming from the chimney, where a girl with a scar on her left palm pried open a trap with her bare hands rather than finishing what the trap had started. He held up his own hand and turned it, and there, faint, she could see the mark, a thin white seam at his wrist where steel had bitten before she'd freed him. I was awake for some of it. Not all. Enough. The silence in the hall had a texture now, a weight, the particular charged quiet that comes right before something irreversible. She had a knife at my throat, he said, quieter now, almost to himself, almost only to her, and a pelt worth a season's debt lying still under her hands, and she chose to stitch me instead of skin me. He looked at her like he was trying to read something in her face that the scent alone hadn't told him. Why? He asked. And it was not a king's question, not in that moment. It was a man's. Why didn't you take the pelt? Wren thought of Pip's stomach, of the toll ledger, of 4 winters without her mother and a father whose knee got worse every year, and a debt that pelt would have erased in a single morning's work. She thought of all the practical, sensible, true answers she could have given a king, and what came out of her mouth instead was the only honest one she had. You looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth trusting, she said. Seemed only fair I decide the same about you. Something in his jaw worked, tight and sudden, like a man absorbing a blow he hadn't braced for. Captain Reed, Alaric said, without turning his head, see that Miss Ashby is given quarters, and that the trespass charge against her is struck from whatever record Lord Garrick was so eager to read it from. Your Majesty, Garrick said, smooth as oil over water. The law regarding the toll line exists for reasons beyond this single instance. The law, Alaric said, exists to protect this pack's land from those who take from it without right. This girl gave more to this pack in one night, with no expectation of thanks, than most men in this hall have given it in a year. He finally looked away from Wren, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop a degree when he did. I'll hear the law's finer points another day, my lord. Today I'd rather not stand here arguing while my ribs remind me, rather forcefully, that I owe a debt I haven't yet found a way to pay. He turned back to her before he left, and for one unguarded moment, with the whole hall watching, his composure slipped enough that she saw something underneath it. Not a king's mask, not even a man's. Something younger. Something that had spent 3 nights certain it would die alone in the cold, and had instead been sung to sleep by a stranger who didn't ask for a name before she earned the right to one. Stay, he said. Quiet. Not quite in order. Please. Then the mask came back up, and he was a king again, and he left the hall on legs that should not have been walking at all, and Wren stood very still in the silence he left behind and felt the whole weight of every eye in the room turn, slow and disbelieving, to settle on her. Captain Reed was the one who finally crossed the floor to her, a broad, easy-moving man with the tip of his left ear missing, an old scar gone smooth with age, and a habit she'd learn, of whistling 3 low notes before he came through any door, a courtesy he extended even to a cell. He gave her none of that warning now. There was no door between them, only the open hall and 100 staring lords. Well, he said, low, for her ears only, the corner of his mouth twitching toward something that wasn't quite a smile. That's not how mornings here usually go. Is he always like that? Wren asked, because it was easier than asking any of the questions actually crowding her throat. Like what? Stubborn enough to walk on a wound that should have kept him flat for a week, just to make sure he wasn't dreaming the scent of the girl who saved him? Reed's missing ear tip caught the torchlight as he tilted his head. No, not always. I've known him 11 years, and I've never once seen him do anything like that. He studied her a moment, not unkindly, the way a man studies a puzzle he suspects he'll enjoy solving. "You'd best get used to people looking at you strangely, Miss Ashby. I have a feeling it's only just started." He was, in this, as in most things, entirely correct. They gave her a room 3 times the size of her family's whole cabin, with a hearth already lit and a bed with more blankets piled on it than she'd ever owned in her life. And Wren sat on the edge of it for a long while, simply breathing in a space that smelled of beeswax and clean linen instead of smoke and old fat. Feeling for the first time since the riders had come to her door something close to fear that had nothing to do with trespass charges at all. She had stitched a king's ribs with boiled sinew. She had hummed her dead mother's lullaby into the fur of the most powerful wolf in 3 packs worth of territory, not knowing what he was, only knowing that something in her hadn't been able to do otherwise. And now he had asked her, in front of his whole court, to stay. She did not know yet that the wound she'd closed had been opened by treachery rather than chance. She did not know that the man who'd ridden to drag her here in chains wore gloves to hide more than cold hands, or that the clove oil sharpness layered over his scent was a curtain drawn deliberately across a much darker truth. She did not know. Sitting there in borrowed warmth with her own scarred palm pressed flat against the unfamiliar softness of a stranger's blanket, that the night she'd spent choosing mercy over hunger had already set in motion something far larger than a trespass charge, a reckoning 4 years in the making, and she, without ever asking for the part, had just become impossible for either side to ignore. She only knew that somewhere in this enormous stone hall, a king with a scar shaped like a crescent moon at his throat was lying in a bed of his own, breathing easier than he had in days, and that some small, foolish, traitorous part of her chest had gone warm at the thought of it. It was not a comfortable feeling. She decided firmly to ignore it. She lasted exactly 2 days before that resolution failed her entirely. A healer came the first morning, an older woman named Selah, with hands stained permanent green-gray from years of crushing willow bark and yarrow, who looked Wren over with the brisk, assessing eye of someone deciding whether a tool was sharp enough to keep, and told her, without much ceremony, that His Majesty had requested her presence in his recovery chamber, on the grounds that the wound had reopened overnight, and the fever that came with it responded to nothing the pack's healers had tried. Nothing, Wren asked. Tinctures, bonefire smoke, a binding chant older than this hall. Selah's mouth pulled sideways, somewhere between amused and unsettled. "He quieted for you once, by every account given. The healers thought it worth trying again before we resort to anything more drastic. The chamber they led her to was warm and dim, heavy curtains drawn against the daylight, and the scent hit her before her eyes had even adjusted. Cedar and storm iron. Yes, but wrong now. Sour underneath. Threaded through with something bitter and metallic that made the fine hair on her arms stand up. Wolfsbane. She knew that smell from her father's traps, the rare poison used against creatures too strong to kill with steel alone. Alaric lay against a bank of pillows with his shirt open and a fresh bandage stark white across ribs gone fever-flushed, his jaw clenched tight, a fine tremor running through muscles that should have been still. His eyes found her the instant she crossed the threshold, glassy with fever but no less direct for it. "You came," he said, and his voice cracked rough around the words. "I was fetched," she said, because admitting otherwise felt dangerous. "Apparently, I'm good for more than poaching around here." A healer murmured something about the wound having wept through the new dressing twice since dawn, about a tremor that hadn't eased with anything they'd tried. Wren barely heard it. She was watching the muscle jump along his forearm, the sweat at his temple, and some instinct older than thought had her crossing the room and sitting on the edge of his bed before anyone had given her leave to. "Move your hand," she told him, when his fingers pressed white-knuckled against the bandage. Let me see. Bossy, he managed, for someone who was a prisoner 2 days ago. And you're a poor patient for someone who's apparently a king. She peeled the dressing back with careful fingers, and the wound beneath was angry. The skin around it shot through with thin, dark lines like ink bled into water. Wolfsbane, working its way along whatever blade had cut him, slow and patient as poison always was. This isn't a wound healing wrong. This is poison still working. The healers know that. His jaw was tight, fighting another tremor. There's no cure for it, only time, and enough strength to outlast it. Then we'll outlast it, she said, with more confidence than she had any right to, and laid her palm flat against his chest, over the worst of the dark lines, the way she might have pressed a hand to a feverish child, because it was the only thing she'd ever known to do for pain that had no other remedy. Breathe with me, slow as you can manage. She did not hum, not at first, but somewhere in the third long minute, with his breath finally beginning to match the rhythm she set with her own, the lullaby found its way out of her anyway, low and unthinking, the same 3 notes that had eased a wolf to sleep on her cabin floor. The tremor in his muscles eased before the second verse. By the third, his breathing had gone deep and even, and the dark lines threading from the wound had visibly slowed their crawl, like a tide called back by something it couldn't argue with. How? Selah breathed from the doorway. Are you doing that? Wren didn't know. She kept humming anyway, because stopping felt like letting go of a rope mid-climb, and it was a long while before she trusted the steadiness of his pulse enough to lift her hand away. I don't know what I am to you, Alaric said quietly, once the worst of it had passed, his eyes heavy but clear again, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look anywhere else and unable to manage it. I don't have a word for it. I've read every account in this library twice since they carried me back here, and there isn't a clean one. Maybe it doesn't need a word, Wren said, though her own heart was beating hard enough that she suspected he could probably hear it. Everything in my world needs a word, Wren Ashby. His thumb found the heavy ring on his other hand without his seeming to notice he'd done it, pressing against the carved wolf's head set into the silver. A habit she'd come to learn. That meant he was holding something back by force, rather than by ease. Naming a thing is the first step toward controlling it. I find I have very little control left around you. She should have had a clever answer for that. She had none. The fire popped in the grate, and somewhere outside a hawk screamed thin and far off, and the space between them filled instead with a silence so charged it had its own weight. His eyes on her mouth for 1/2 second longer than courtesy allowed, before he caught himself and looked away, jaw tight, thumb still pressed hard against that ring. You should rest, she said, finally, standing before the silence could do anything else to either of them. Probably, he agreed, and didn't ask her to stay, though something in the set of his shoulders said he wanted to. She left before either of them could change their mind about that. The days that followed took on a shape she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. She was summoned each morning to sit with him an hour, sometimes 2. Her hand pressed flat over the wound, while the poison slowly lost its grip, and each time the fever eased and the tremors stopped, he talked to her in a low, unguarded voice that the rest of the hall, she suspected, rarely heard at all. He told her on the 3rd day about the parents he'd lost before he was old enough to grow into the crown they left him. A coup 4 years gone. Blood spilled in a hall, not unlike this one. A boy of 20 crowned over his own father's body with the smoke of betrayal still hanging in the rafters. Who did it? She asked, before she could think better of asking. Something closed behind his eyes. A name I'm not yet ready to say out loud, even to you. Even to me, she repeated, and didn't push, though the word even sat in her chest like a held coal, warm and dangerous both. He told her, on the 4th day, about the ambush that had put him in her trapline in the first place. Riders he'd trusted. A blade he hadn't seen coming. A flight through the dark on legs that hadn't known whether they were running toward safety or simply away from death, until steel had closed on his hind leg, and the pain had, strangely, been the thing that finally let him stop. I thought the trap was the end of it, he admitted. I thought whoever found me would finish what the ambush started, and by then I was tired enough not to fight it very hard. And instead you got me, Wren said, with a knife and a grudge against hungry winters. And instead, he said, very quietly, watching her with an attention that made the warm room feel smaller, I got the only soft thing that's happened to me in 4 years. She didn't have an answer for that either. Each unguarded thing he gave her piled onto the last, an entire collection of moments where his honesty outpaced anything she knew how to say back. And each one left her a little more undone, a little less certain of the walls she'd built around her own chest since her mother died and taught her, without meaning to, that softness was a thing the world took advantage of. It was on the 5th day that Lady Isolde Vane found a reason to be in the corridor outside his chamber, at exactly the hour Wren was due to leave it. She was lovely in the particular, deliberate way court ladies were trained to be lovely. Dark hair coiled with silver pins, a scent of jasmine oil worn strong enough to overpower the room. Too strong, Wren would think later. The kind of strength meant to announce a presence rather than simply exist within it. She fell into step beside Wren as though they were old friends, which they were not, and had never been. "You're the trapper's girl," Isolde said, pleasant as poisoned honey. "The whole hall's talking of nothing else, saving a king with a sewing needle. Quite the story for the lower halls to tell." "It wasn't a story," Wren said. "It was a wound and a long night." "Of course." Isolde's smile didn't move from its careful place. "My father says the bond between an alpha and his Luna is meant to be tested by trial, you know. Fire or flood, or some great danger faced together. He finds it terribly convenient that you happen to be the one testing his." "Your father," Wren said, "seems to find a great many things convenient that I'd call coincidence." Something flickered behind Isolde's eyes. Not quite anger, something colder and more calculating, before the pleasant mask resettled. "His Majesty has obligations this hall has been patient about for 4 years, Miss Ashby. A pack needs a Luna with blood the council can vouch for. Alliances, history, not—" Her gaze swept down Wren's plain wool dress and worn boots without bothering to hide the assessment. A passing fever brought on by gratitude. She left before Wren could find an answer sharp enough to satisfy her, and Wren stood alone in the corridor with jasmine oil souring in her throat, and a small, cold seed of doubt planted exactly where Isolde had meant to plant it. She told herself, walking back to her borrowed room, that it didn't matter what a lord's daughter thought of her plain dress or her common blood. She told herself that several more times before she managed to half believe it. It would have helped, perhaps, if Alaric himself hadn't given her good reason to wonder, not 3 days later, whether Isolde's father had been entirely wrong. A formal hearing had been called. Garrick, smooth and tireless, pressing the council toward clarity on matters of succession and alliance now that the king had survived his ordeal. The wording of it careful enough that Wren understood, even from the back of the hall where she'd been placed among the lower households, that the matter being discussed was, in part, her. "The pack requires certainty," one of the older lords was saying, when she slipped into the gallery, "particularly given how close we came to losing our king entirely. Lady Isolde's bloodline has stood beside this throne for 3 generations. A Luna chosen from outside pack blood, however the circumstance of her finding him, sets a precedent the council cannot in good conscience. With respect, Alaric said, seated at the head of the long table with his color finally returned, his voice level in a way that made Wren's stomach tighten with something close to dread. No formal claim has been made on anyone. The matter is premature. The hall murmured its relief. Wren felt something in her own chest go very still and very cold, hearing it. He hadn't looked at her once since she'd entered the gallery. Not once, in a room where his eyes had, days before, found her like a compass finding true north without even searching. He sat with his jaw set and his hands folded and let the council talk around her like she was a question still being weighed rather than a person standing 8 steps away. And when the session ended and the lords filed out murmuring their satisfaction, he left through a side door without so much as a glance toward the gallery where she stood. She did not chase him down. She had her pride, even bruised as it currently was, and pride, in that moment, was the only thing keeping her upright. He didn't mean it the way it looked, Captain Reed said later, finding her on the east wall where she'd gone to be alone with the cold and the view of trees that, at least, smelled like home. His missing ear tip caught the wind. I've known him 11 years. He doesn't do anything by accident, but he also doesn't explain himself when explaining would put someone he cares for in danger. In danger from what? Wren asked. From a council deciding I'm not good enough? I already knew that, Captain. I didn't need a king to confirm it by saying nothing. Reed was quiet a moment, choosing words with visible care. Garrick's been pressing this hall for 4 years to marry Alaric off to Isolde, calls it alliance, calls it stability. He whistled a low note, the same habit he used at doorways, as though warning himself before he said the next part. What he doesn't say is that the more attention falls on you, the more it falls on the question of who's been quietly assembling enough votes on that council to control the throne, the moment Alaric's guard drops even an inch. A man like that doesn't want a Luna who can't be controlled. He especially doesn't want one with a healer's gift the council can't explain, and a story the lower halls already love. You're saying the king said nothing to protect me. I'm saying he's spent 4 years learning that the people closest to him are the ones who get used against him. Reed's eyes were kind, but his voice didn't soften the truth in it. Doesn't make today hurt any less. I'd know. It didn't, in fact, make it hurt any less. Wren stood on that wall a long while after he left her, the wind pulling at her hair, and let herself feel, fully and without flinching from it, the particular ache of being chosen in private and abandoned in public. And underneath the ache, stubborn and unwelcome, the first cold thread of her own fault in it. She had told no one, not her father, not Reed, not even Alaric in so many words, about the lie she'd already told once, to protect herself, the morning after the trap. She understood, standing there, that she had been keeping a door of her own half shut even while resenting him for shutting his. It was 2 nights later, restless and unable to sleep, that she went looking for the hall's library, hoping a dull book might do what nothing else had managed and quiet her mind enough to rest. She found instead an open door she shouldn't have, and Lord Garrick's voice low and urgent on the other side of it, speaking to a man whose face she couldn't see. The wolfsbane was meant to finish what the blade started, Garrick was saying, soft and furious, the clove oil sharpness of his disguised scent doing nothing, this close, to hide the rot of fear underneath it. 4 years of patience, and a trapper's daughter with a lullaby undoes it in a fortnight. The dose should have killed him slow enough no healer would think to question it. Get me more. We are running out of time before the council starts asking why he's healing at all. Wren did not breathe. She did not move. Through the gap in the door she could see, for one bare instant, Garrick pull off his glove to wipe sweat from his palm. And there, across his knuckles, 4 parallel scars, old but unmistakable, the exact width and spacing of a wolf's claw raked in self-defense. She had seen those same scars before, on the back of her own hand almost. No, not hers. She had seen the matching set, fresh and dark, in the report read aloud at Alaric's hearing the day they'd dragged her into that hall. A wound the king himself had managed to land on his attacker before the blade found his ribs. The clove oil wasn't vanity. It was a curtain drawn over the one scent that would have given him away to any wolf who got close enough, and gloves were the only thing standing between 4 years of careful loyalty and the truth written plainly across his own hand. Garrick Vane had tried to kill his king, and he was not finished trying. Wren backed away from that door on legs gone unsteady, her own heart slamming loud enough she was half certain it would give her away, and did not stop walking until she'd put 3 corridors and a locked door between herself and what she'd just learned. She did not sleep that night either, but for entirely different reasons than the ones that had kept her awake the night before. She told no one until morning, and even then, hesitation closed her throat the moment she thought through what telling the truth would cost. Garrick was the council's steward, trusted by half the lords who'd just spent an afternoon debating her unworthiness. Her word against his was a trapper's daughter's word against 4 years of careful, patient reputation and some old, bone-deep instinct. The same one that had made her lie to her own father about an empty trap, whispered that speaking now, without proof beyond her own ears, would see her discredited, removed from the hall, perhaps worse, before the truth ever reached anyone who could act on it. So she did what she had always done, when the world handed her a danger too large to face alone. She decided to handle it quietly, and by herself, and told herself it was caution rather than the same old fear dressed in new clothes. It was, in the end, the costliest decision she made in that whole, long fortnight. She wrote to her father instead, a short, careful letter, asking after Pip, after the toll debt, after nothing she thought dangerous to say. And 3 days later, the answer that came back was not from her father's hand at all, but a single line scrawled by a neighbor's boy. Your father's been taken in for questioning regarding stolen pack silver. Says he knows nothing. Toll collector won't say when he'll be freed. Wren read it twice before the words made any sense, and when they did, the floor seemed to tilt beneath her. Garrick. It had to be Garrick. A warning sent the only way that wouldn't implicate him, a message clear as a held knife. I know you heard something. Stay quiet, or the people you love pay for your silence. She went to Alaric's chamber that evening with the letter still crumpled in her fist, not caring, for once, whether pride or distance or council politics stood between them, and found him at his window with a glass of something amber and untouched in his hand, his shoulders set in the particular tightness she'd come to recognize as a man holding something in by force. My father's been taken, she said, before he could speak first. Accused of stealing silver he's never had reason or means to steal. I think it's Garrick's doing. I think he's trying to make sure I keep quiet about something I overheard 3 nights ago, and I should have told you the moment I heard it, and I didn't, because I was afraid, and now my father's sitting in some cell because I chose caution over courage. Alaric set the glass down very slowly. What did you overhear? She told him. All of it. The gloves, the scars, the wolfsbane, the voice in the dark demanding more poison before the council started asking the wrong questions. She watched something in his face go from disbelief to a terrible, settling certainty. The kind of certainty a man only wears when a suspicion he's carried for years finally finds the proof it's been waiting for. My father's hall guard, he said quietly. The night of the coup. He was 16. Too young to hold a blade in the fighting, they said. Too young to be questioned about where he was. His jaw worked. I never let myself finish that thought before now. Alaric. It was the first time she'd used his name without title, without the careful distance she'd kept since the hall. My father is in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. I need you to fix this before pride or politics or anything else gets in the way of it. Something in him broke open at that. Not weakness, she would understand later, but the particular relief of a man finally allowed to act on a truth he'd been forced to sit on for far too long. Then we'll fix it tonight, he said. And we'll fix the rest of it tomorrow, in front of every lord who spent a fortnight deciding you weren't worth claiming. You don't have to claim anything, she said, old hurt rising fast and unbidden. You made that clear enough in council. I made silence look like denial because I was trying to keep Garrick from understanding how much you'd already become a threat to him, Alaric said, low and rough, crossing the room to stand close enough that the cedar and storm scent of him filled the space between every breath she took. It was the wrong choice. I knew it the moment I made it, and I've regretted it every hour since, and I am done. Entirely done. Making choices that protect my crown at the cost of you standing alone. The fire cracked once behind them. Somewhere outside, a wolf howled, low and long, and Wren stood very still in the warm dark with her father's freedom and her own foolish, traitorous heart both hanging in the same uncertain balance. Then don't make me stand alone, she said, starting now. He didn't kiss her then. There were guards to send, a father to free, a traitor's plans to unravel before morning, but his hand found hers in the dark, careful over the old crescent scar on her palm, and held it like a man finally allowed to hold the one steady thing in a hall full of knives, and that, for that one breathless night, was enough. Thomas Ashby was freed before dawn, dragged from his cell pale and furious, and demanding to know what in the pack's name had happened to his daughter that armed riders now answered to her name as readily as the king's. And Wren met him at the gate with her arms around his neck before he'd finished the question, and didn't let go for a long while. You've got some explaining to do, Rennie, he said into her hair, voice rough with relief he wouldn't otherwise have shown. I know, she said. I'll start at the beginning. There's a wolf I didn't skin. It was, in the days that followed, harder than freeing her father to unravel the rest of it. Garrick had spent 4 years weaving himself into every corner of the council's trust, and proof that would satisfy a hall full of lords required more than a trapper's daughter's overheard whisper through a half-open door. Alaric set Reed quietly, hunting the source of the wolfsbane, a poison rare enough that whoever supplied it left a trail, however faint, while Wren, against every instinct that told her to stay hidden and safe, agreed to something far more dangerous, to be seen, deliberately and often, at the king's side, loud enough and visible enough that Garrick's patience would fray, and a frayed man made mistakes a patient one never would. It worked faster than either of them expected, and far worse than either of them hoped. It was Sella, of all people, who found the thread that finally unraveled everything, and not in the matter of poison or proof, but in a much older mystery that had nothing to do with Garrick at all. She found Wren in the herb garden one gray afternoon, turning over the pages of an old genealogical record with the particular intensity of a woman who has just discovered something she can't quite believe. Your mother, Selah said without preamble. Was she called Mireille, born somewhere east of the old Lothian territory? Wren's hands went still over the lavender she'd been pinching back. How did you know that? Because there's a record here, 15 years old, of a Lothian healer's daughter who vanished from pack rolls the same year the Lothian pack itself was burned out by a border dispute no one living remembers the cause of. Selah's eyes were sharp, kind, careful. And because the first time you laid your hand on the king's wound and it answered you the way no human hand has any right to be answered, I started wondering whether human was ever quite the right word for you at all. The ground seemed to tilt under Wren for the second time that fortnight. My mother never told me, never once. She raised me on stories about the woods and never once said a word about being the last living daughter of a pack erased from every map that mattered. Selah's voice gentled. Some wounds get buried so deep the next generation never even feels the scar. I think your mother buried hers the day she fled what was left of her people and built a life pretending she'd never had one. She closed the record gently. It would explain a great deal, Wren. Why animals trust you before they've any reason to. Why a poison no human hand has ever soothed went quiet under yours. Why a bond meant only for Wolf and Wolf found you anyway, and didn't seem to mind in the least that half your blood had been hiding from itself for 20 years. Wren sat with that a long while after Selah had gone, turning her own scarred palm over in the gray afternoon light, feeling something settle into place that she hadn't known was missing. Not an answer to every question, but a quiet, steadying certainty that the thing inside her that had always made her feel a half step apart from everyone around her, too sharp-eared, too sure-footed in the dark woods, too readily trusted by creatures that trusted no one, had never been a flaw at all. It had been a birthright, hidden so well even she hadn't known to look for it. She did not feel less ordinary, exactly. She felt, for the first time, like the word ordinary had simply never applied to her, and never would have, whether or not a king's wolf had ever wandered into her trap. She told Alaric that evening, sitting beside him on the same stone wall where Reed had once found her grieving a different kind of truth, and watched something in his face open all the way, unguarded, in a manner she hadn't seen since the fevered night his pulse had finally steadied under her palm. That's why the bond took so completely, he said, almost to himself, turning her hand over in his to look at the old crescent scar with something close to wonder. I thought, gods, Wren, I thought it might be a fluke, a wolf's desperate mind finding comfort in the first kind hand it met. I never let myself believe it could be the real thing, because the real thing isn't supposed to happen to a human, and some cowardly part of me has spent 2 weeks bracing to lose you to that very fact. You don't have to brace for it anymore, she said. No, he agreed, low, and finally, he kissed her, slow and certain in the cold evening air, his hand cradling her jaw like something he'd been forbidden to touch and had decided, at last, he no longer cared about the forbidding, and the warmth that spread through her chest at the contact had nothing to do with the fire behind them, and everything to do with a bond 2 weeks in the careful, painful making, finally, quietly, beginning to seal. It did not seal entirely, not yet. That, they would both come to understand, required more than a private kiss on a cold wall. It required choosing each other where everyone could see, and Garrick, increasingly desperate, was not finished trying to make sure that choice never came. He moved 3 nights later. At the autumn feast the council had insisted on holding in honor of the king's recovery. A feast Garrick himself had pushed hardest to schedule, and Wren understood why the moment Reed found her in the corridor outside the hall, breathless, his missing ear tip flushed red from running. He's doubled the kitchen staff tonight, Reed said. New faces, none of them known to the regular cooks, and the wine for the high table's already been poured. Wren did not wait for him to finish the thought. She was moving before he'd finished speaking, skirts gathered in one fist, down the corridor and through the doors of a hall already half full of lords in their finest black and silver, candlelight glinting off raised cups, Garrick himself seated near the high table with a composure so perfect it had to be costing him everything he had left to maintain it. Alaric was lifting his cup when she reached him. "Don't," she said, loud enough that the nearest tables turned, loud enough that there was no taking it back now, no quiet correction later. "Don't drink that." The hall went still in the particular way it had the first time she'd stood accused in its center, except this time every eye that turned to her did not see a trespasser. They saw the trapper's daughter who'd healed their king, standing between him and a cup of poured wine, with a certainty that needed no further explanation to anyone who'd spent the last fortnight watching her prove, again and again, that her instincts ran truer than most men's careful plans. Alaric set the cup down without question. "Why?" "Because I can smell it," Wren said, and her voice didn't shake, though everything else in her did. Wolfsbane, faint, under the wine, the way it was faint under the bandage that wouldn't heal. I'd know that smell now in my sleep. She turned, slow and deliberate, to the man seated near the high table whose composure had finally begun to crack. "Wouldn't you, Lord Garrick, seeing as you've had so much practice measuring the dose?" Garrick rose. Whatever calculation he'd been running behind his careful eyes for 4 years collapsed all at once into something raw and furious. "This is the word of a trapper's daughter against the steward of this council." "It's the word of a trapper's daughter," Alaric said, standing slowly, every line of him gone cold and lethal in a way Wren had not yet seen. "Matched against a scar on your knuckles that matches the wound I gave my own attacker 4 nights before I bled out in her trap line. Matched against a supplier of wolfsbane that Captain Reed tracked to your own household steward 3 days ago. Matched." And his voice dropped, terrible and quiet. "Against 4 years of watching you counsel patience to a counsel you were quietly poisoning my parents' memory to control." The hall had gone utterly silent. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath. "You were 16, Alaric said, "the night my father died. Too young to question. I never once thought to ask why a boy too young to fight was somehow never where the fighting was." Garrick's hand moved toward his belt. He did not get far. Reed was already there, blade drawn, 2 guardsmen flanking him before the gesture finished, and whatever last desperate plan Garrick Vane had been holding in reserve died there, in front of the entire hall, in the space of a single breath. "Take him," Alaric said, "and take his daughter into careful watch until we know the full reach of what he's built. No harm to her unless harm's earned. She's not yet proven herself her father's blood." It was done in minutes. The hall's silence broke into a roar of disbelief and fury that took the guards a long while to settle. And through all of it, Wren stood very still at the center of the storm she'd just caused, breathing hard, her heart slamming loud enough to drown out half the noise around her. Alaric crossed to her the moment the worst of it had quieted, and did not stop at a respectful distance. "You saved my life twice in a fortnight," he said, loud enough now for the whole hall to hear. No caution left in his voice at all. No careful political distance. Nothing held back. Once with a needle and thread, and once with nothing but your own nose and the courage to use it in front of every lord who'd already decided you weren't worth claiming. "Alaric," she started, some old instinct still bracing for the cost of being seen this plainly. "I'm done weighing costs," he said. "I've spent 4 years letting fear of losing what I love decide what I'm allowed to want. I am not spending a single hour more of it." He took her hand, the scarred one, the one that had pried open a trap and closed a wound and pressed flat against poison until it slowed, and turned to face a hall full of lords who had, not 3 weeks past, watched her stand accused as a poacher in this very room. "This is Wren Ashby, daughter of Thomas Ashby, of the border holding the toll line was built to keep poor." She is of Lofen blood, hidden these 20 years, and she is the truest mate this bond has ever found for me, proven by every test this hall could throw at her without once meaning to. His voice did not waver. I claim her. Before this council, before this pack, before whatever ghosts of old prejudice still think a trapper's daughter unworthy of a crown. I claim her, and I will hear no objection that doesn't come from her own mouth. Wren felt it before she understood it, a warmth spreading outward from where his hand held hers, threading up through her arm and settling, impossibly, in her chest, like a held note finally resolving into the chord it had been reaching for all along. Around the hall she heard it too, in the way every wolf-blooded lord and lady in that room drew breath at once, scenting something in the air that hadn't been there a moment before. 2 threads of scent, hers and his, winding together into something neither alone, cedar and storm and pine smoke and snow resolving into a single note the whole hall could read as plainly as a name. I claim him too, Wren said, because it was true. Because it had been true since a night 3 weeks gone when she'd chosen mercy over hunger, and never once regretted it. Because the only fear left in her chest was the ordinary, human fear of a thing this good being real. For what it's worth, coming from a trapper's daughter. It's worth everything, Alaric said, low, only for her. It's worth the whole crown. The bond sealed between them with no more drama than a held breath finally released. No flash of light, no thunderclap. Only a warmth that settled deep and certain into her bones, and the unmistakable rippling hush of an entire hall of pack lords lowering, one by one, into a bow. It started at the high table and moved outward like water finding its level. Lords who had sneered at her plain wool dress dropping their eyes first, then their knees. Isolde, pale and silent, sinking last of all, jaw tight with whatever private reckoning she was keeping behind her composure. Even the serving girls along the far wall, who had never once in 3 weeks been required to acknowledge Wren Ashby's existence at all, bending low with a respect that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the old, simple pack law written into bone long before any council learned to argue around it. Bow to the alphas chosen, or bow to nothing at all. Wren stood in the center of it, with her scarred hand still held fast in a king's, feeling the warmth of the bond settle deeper with every passing second, and thought, with a clarity that startled her, that she had spent her whole life believing power was a thing that happened to other people, in other halls, born into blood she'd never carry. She had been wrong about that. She had simply never asked what her own blood was for. Later, much later, once the hall had finally emptied and the candles burned low and Pip had been sent for with an escort grand enough to make a 9-year-old's eyes go round as moons. Once her father had stood in this same hall and wept without shame at the sight of his daughter wearing a crown he'd never dreamed she'd be offered. Alaric found her again on the same stone wall where it had all quietly begun to turn, the cold air sharp and clean, the forest beyond it dark and humming with the ordinary night sounds of a world that had no idea how completely it had just shifted. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her, his shoulder warm against hers in a way that no longer needed permission. "One," she said. "I should have told my father about the wolf the very first morning. Would have saved us both a great deal of trouble. And robbed me of the chance to walk into that hall on a wound I had no business standing on, just to find out if the scent on my own skin matched the hands I remembered." His thumb found her scarred palm in the dark, tracing the old crescent mark with a tenderness that still, every time, undid something in her chest. "I wouldn't trade that morning for anything, Wren. Not the trap, not the trespass, not even the fortnight you spent thinking I'd chosen pride over you. You did choose pride over me. Once." "Once," he agreed, No defense in it at all, only the plain, unflinching honesty she'd come to trust more than any crown. And I'll spend a good deal longer than once making certain you never have cause to doubt the choice again. Somewhere below them, faint on the cold wind, a wolf howled long and low, and this time Wren knew, without needing to ask, exactly which voice in the dark belonged to home. She had walked into these woods a poor trapper's daughter with nothing to her name but a scarred palm and a hungry family, and a wolf bleeding in her snare had asked nothing of her at all except the one thing she'd never learned to withhold, even from a stranger, even from a king, a little mercy, freely given. It turned out mercy had simply been waiting, all along, to be recognized for exactly what it was worth. She leaned into his shoulder, and he turned his face into her hair, and the whole vast hall behind them settled into the particular hush of a world, finally, quietly, at peace with its own true shape. And somewhere far below, the entire pack she had once trespassed against now bowed whenever she passed, not because a king had commanded it, but because the bond between them had simply made it true.